Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, personal development, and spirituality. Today's episode is with Ethan Kross. Ethan is one of the world's leading experts on controlling the conscious mind, and he's an award-winning professor at the University of Michigan's top-ranked psychology department and its Ross School of Business, and he's also the director of the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory. Ethan has participated in policy discussions at the White House. He's also been interviewed about some of his research on CBS Evening News, Good Morning America, Anderson Cooper, and NPR's Morning Edition. And his research has also been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and more. So I'm so excited to welcome Ethan to the show today. I actually heard about him through a colleague of mine who had heard about his show, had heard about an episode that he did on another podcast, which I listened to. So thank you so much for joining us, Ethan.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise. And I think it's so relevant and important, especially today, because I believe that this pandemic has left us all in a very, I think, raw and vulnerable space. So just to kick it off, Ethan, can you tell us, what does it actually mean to have an inner critic?
Well, to understand what an inner critic is, we have to step back and first talk about what it means to have an inner voice. And I like to define that at the outset because that term is used in a lot of different ways, depending on who you talk to. When scientists use that term, what we mean is we're talking about our ability to silently use language to reflect on our lives. And the ability to do that, that's a tool that we possess that I like to think of. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife of the human mind that lets us do lots of different things, everything from keeping a nugget of verbal information active in your head. So if you go to the grocery store and you think to yourself, hey, what do I have to buy? And then you go down the list in your head, yogurt, bread, milk, that's your inner voice. We also use our inner voice to plan and simulate future activities. Like before you go on an interview or a date, you might think to yourself what you're going to say. And we also use our inner voice to coach ourselves along. So when I'm exercising, for example, I often think to myself, come on, you could do it. 3 more reps, 1, 2, 3, and I count down. So your inner voice lets you do all of those things. But as many listeners will no doubt be familiar, sometimes when we experience adversity, what we do is we turn our attention inward to tap into this tool. But we don't get encouraging advice from that inner voice. And instead, we start hearing our inner critic. So we turn our attention inward to come up with a solution to our problems, but we end up worrying and ruminating and catastrophizing instead. That's the dark side of our inner voice, and it's what I call chatter. And I think it's one of the big problems we face as a culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people probably don't even know when their inner critic is starting, right? And when their inner voice, like the encouragement piece, is ending. Because it's sometimes a lot of people are just so unconscious of it even occurring. So I'm curious, how do you guide people to deal with their inner critic? Let's say, you have something come up that is a difficult situation, and you say, your inner critic says something like, I'm not good enough, or I don't deserve this. How would you guide people through this process?
Well, I think step one is having a vocabulary that allows us to identify what is happening in our minds. As you said, a lot of us don't get a playbook growing up. We are not taught, hey, this is what your inner voice is. Here's the positive side of it. Here's the negative. And I think just knowing that your inner voice can have these manifestations, that's really potentially powerful, because once we have a way of labeling and describing the experience we're going through, we can then choose to take action to manage that situation. So step one is understanding what chatter is. Once you understand what it is, most people are going to be motivated to, I think, to reduce that state because it's so terribly uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good to be stuck in a negative thought loop, to be stuck experiencing intense anxiety or sadness or anger. And that's where the different tools, the science-based tools that I talk about in my book come into play. So what we know is that there's no single one-size-fits-all approach to reducing your chatter, to wrestling with that inner critic. Instead, what we know is we've evolved to possess lots and lots and lots of different tools that we can use to manage our chatter. Sometimes it requires using not just one tool, but several tools, and different types of tools work for different people in different situations. So one of the things I try to do in my book is lay out what the toolbox is. What are the different things you can do to manage your chatter? To then leave it up to the reader to figure out, hey, these are the tools that work best for me, given my unique situation in life.
And so can we double click and maybe go through an example of a tool that has worked for someone that you've worked with? You feel free to pick any example. And of course, we'll keep it anonymous if you want to make up a name.
Well, I'll just, how about I just use tools that work for me? This way we don't have to have any anonymity. So why don't I tell you about a couple of my favorites? There are close to 30 that are out there. I'll just tell you about a handful. One of the things we know about chatter is that when we experience it, we get zoomed in very narrowly on our problems. All we could think about is the thing that we're experiencing chatter about. We're stuck in this tunnel vision. And what we've learned is that when that happens, it can be really helpful to be able to step back or zoom out to look at the bigger picture, to get what we call in technical terms psychological distance from our experience. And it turns out there are lots of different distancing tools that are out there. One of my favorite tools, and the one that is my first line of defense when I'm experiencing chatter, is something that we call distanced self-talk. And what it involves doing is trying to coach yourself through a situation like you would give advice to another person, and actually using the structure of language to help you do that. What I mean is use your own name or the second person pronoun you to silently coach yourself through a problem. We typically use names when we think about or refer to other people, not when we think about ourselves. And so what we've learned through lots of experiments is that when a person uses their own name to coach themselves through a problem, all right, Ethan, here's how you're going to manage the situation. What that essentially does is it turns us, it switches our perspective. It gets us to start giving ourselves advice like we'd give advice to a close friend. And that's potentially really useful because one of the things we know about people is we are much, much better at giving advice to others than we are taking our own advice. It's really amazing when we do experiments in our lab. We often have people think about their deepest worries and ruminations. And sometimes participants don't want to tell us what they've thought about. They're embarrassed to share the thoughts that are streaming through their own heads. They're saying things to themselves that they would never dream about saying to their best friend. And so what distant self-talk does is it helps us change the way we relate to ourselves, which can be useful.
So Ethan, can we double click on that and actually let's maybe use you as an example. So something that you're dealing with and you would tell yourself Ethan, you would kind of address yourself from maybe a different point POV, right? Can you explicitly share how that would play out in the dialogue?
Yeah, I would coach myself through the situation using my own name. All right, Ethan, here's how you're going to manage the situation. You've been through this before. You've succeeded in the past. It's going to be fine. And in the worst case scenario, even if you experience some negativity, it'll be over in an hour and then you'll move on to something else. So get to it. So what I'm doing there is I'm basically giving myself advice. I'm coaching myself through the situation like I would give advice to someone else. That's very different from being stuck in a first person narrative where I'm thinking, oh my God, how am I going to manage this situation? I can't do it. I'm not going to be able to perform. Instead of being in this threat mode where I feel like I'm not capable of managing the situation, I'm instead transitioning into giving myself feedback to suggest that I can manage the situation.
Wow, it's so fascinating. So why is that so effective? Like what have you found about this scenario? I mean, because it like kind of is it because it depersonalizes it? What exactly are the mechanics from an emotional level, from like a psychological level? Like how does that play out?
Well, it's pulling you back from the situation. So it's giving you psychological distance, which is allowing you to think more objectively about the situation. And typically, when we zoom out, we often find that there are solutions to the problems that we're managing. And it's also getting you to relate to yourself from a different kind of perspective, thrusting you into that coaching mode. If you think about why is it that we are so adept at giving advice to other people, whereas we flounder to do so with ourselves, one of the reasons for that is when a friend comes to us with a problem that they're experiencing chatter about and asks us for our advice, the problem's not happening to us. We don't have that emotional connection, which can often make it much harder to think objectively. And so what this linguistic shift is doing, what using your own name to coach yourself through a problem is doing, is it's giving you that mental space, putting you in that position to be more objective as you try to work through your experience.
And does this work for any type of grievance? Like, let's say, there's smaller grievances that happen maybe during the day. And then what about kind of these larger grievances, like, the dissolution of a marriage or the death of a partner? I mean, have you studied the kind of range of grievances, and is it just as effective?
Well, we have not studied, and I use the royal we there, myself and other investigators. Um, every kind of grievance that a person is capable of experiencing surely have not been focused on in the lab. Now, that said, we have looked at how this strategy works for experiences that range in their intensity from the minor to the more significant. And what we find across studies is that either the strategy works as well for the more intense stressors as the less intense stressors, or in some cases, we find that it actually is more effective for the more significant stressors. And our interpretation there is that when it comes to run-of-the-mill things that aren't that potent, there's not a whole lot of negative emotion to cloud one's thinking. And so the more negative emotion we're experiencing, the more room there is for these strategies to have their benefits. It's not unlike taking Tylenol to get your fever down. So if you are running a 98.8 fever and you take some Tylenol, it may nudge your temperature down a few tenths of a point, but it's not going to drop it much lower. Whereas if you have a really high fever, there's much more room for the Tylenol to have its effects. So that's what we see happening with this strategy across a couple of different papers. Now, I do want to give a caveat that we have not looked at how this strategy works with people who are suffering from clinical forms of psychopathology or distress, and that remains an open question whether these benefits generalize to those groups. But Yasmin, I want to emphasize that this is one strategy in a much, much larger toolbox of, let's say, 30-something. So while this is my go-to strategy, the first thing I do, in part because it's so easy to do, and we've shown in research that it is very easy to activate this strategy. I would encourage listeners to try it on their own next time you're struggling with something, rather than think to yourself, oh my God, what should I do? Just plug in your own name and think, what should blank? If it's me, what should Ethan do? Give it a shot. But there are many other things we do that people can do. And so let me transition to another strategy. Another easy distancing strategy to use is something that we call mental time travel, or in technical terms, temporal distancing. What this strategy involves is thinking about how you're going to feel about something that's bothering you sometime down the road in the future. When we're experiencing chatter, we get zoomed in on the awfulness of whatever it is we're currently experiencing. Oh my God, how am I going to deal with this event that I have coming up, or this feedback that I just got? And what temporal distancing involves is asking a person to think, hey, how are you going to think about this challenge you're facing a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? What engaging in that mental time travel does for us is it makes us realize that, hey, as awful as what I'm experiencing right now is, it's temporary. It'll eventually fade, because most of our emotional experiences do fade with time. And what that does for people is it highlights the instability of our emotional experience, which, when it comes to negative events, gives us hope that we're going to feel better. And so that's another way you could try to manage your chatter. That's another thing that I'll do. I'll not just coach myself through a situation using my own name, but also think, hey, how am I going to feel about this, a week from now, a month from now? So that's another kind of distancing tool. That's probably the second thing I do. Now, the third thing I'll do is I'll call up one of my chatter advisors. What is a chatter advisor? It's someone in my social network who is particularly adept at helping me reason through and work through a negative experience that I'm dealing with. These are not trained clinicians or coaches or anything of that sort. They are people who do for me two things. Number one, they take the time to listen and hear what I'm going through. So they let me express my emotions a little bit. But importantly, that's not all they do. They're not just getting me to vent about what I'm going through. They listen a little bit. And then at the appropriate time in the conversation, they start trying to help broaden my perspective. They start trying to point out different ways that I might think about this experience, or share with me how they've dealt with these kinds of experiences. And the ability to do those two things, to both let me express my emotions a little bit, but then helping me zoom out to broaden my perspective, that makes them an incredible resource. And not everyone that I'm close to is skilled at helping me do that. There are 3 or 4 people in my life who I can count on to give me good chatter support when it comes to personal issues, maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 even, when it comes to professional issues, work-related issues that I'm dealing with. And so that's another element in my toolbox that I rely on when I'm having some kind of chatter experience.
Yeah, and I would love to hear the rest of the tools, because these two are incredible and amazing. And I already feel so inspired to take action using them, and just thinking about how I can use them in my own life. But yeah, Ethan, if you would like to continue, I would be really happy to hear more about some of the other tools that have worked for you besides those 3. And I think it's funny, as you were talking about the chatter advisor piece, I was sort of thinking there's so many people that would get really reactive when you bring something to the table that is kind of a conflict in your life. And so trying to find those people is also really interesting. And I'm sure some people would have to maybe have an intergenerational exploration of finding the right people who can maybe hold space for certain chatter. But yeah, if you would like to continue, Ethan, I would be really happy to hear more tools if you'd like.
Well, you're absolutely right. You have to be careful who you choose. I often joke, but I'm being serious, that there are many people in my life that I'm very close to. DNA determines it. What I mean by that is I'm related to them. I don't talk to them about my chatter, because the thought that they have is that the way that they can help me is to get me to just express my emotions. And we know from decades of research that just venting your emotions doesn't help people feel better. It makes them feel close and connected to the person they're talking to. It increases friendship bonds. But in terms of providing them with a way of managing their chatter, venting alone doesn't do the trick. It really is this combination of both expressing emotion and zooming out to get that big picture advice. And there are only a handful of people who can help me do that. And so I'm very grateful to them. So switching gears, let me tell you about 2 more strategies that really do constitute the end of my go-to toolbox. one of the other things that I do is very out of character for me. So I like to think of myself as someone who's an organized thinker, but in terms of my external life, I'm not particularly organized. If you were to come into my house on any chatter free day of the week, you'd likely see a trail of clothing from the bathroom to my closet. And if you came into my office at home, there'd be piles of books and papers, often to my wife's dismay. But when I'm experiencing chatter, I do something that's out of character for me. I put everything away, very nice and neat. I tidy up, I organize. When I'm done putting the clothing away in the bedroom, I go down to the kitchen and I wash the dishes and I scrub the counters. What I'm doing there is I'm trying to compensate for the lack of control that I feel when I'm experiencing chatter by exerting control around me. And lots of people do this when they're dealing with distress, and it turns out it can be beneficial. So chatter is often experienced as you don't feel like you're in control, right? Your thoughts, your emotions, they're taking charge of you. And you can compensate for this experience by tidying up and organizing. So that's another thing I can do. And importantly, knowing about how this works scientifically, what that allows me to do is to be proactive about using this tool in my life. I don't have to wait to experience chatter and then just, something inside of me is propelling me to organize. And I feel better now. The moment I detect that chatter brewing, I'll start putting things away, and that can be beneficial. So that's another tool I use. The last tool that is my first line of defense is going for a walk in a green space outside. So walking around my neighborhood or going for a walk in the park. We know that enhancing your exposure to green spaces can be helpful in two ways. Number one, it can provide us with an opportunity to restore our attention. So when we're experiencing chatter, our attention is consumed by our worries and ruminations. What happens when you go for a walk in a green space is your attention gently drifts away from your chatter onto the interesting things that surround you, the flowers, the bushes, the trees. And when your attention drifts away, it gives you an opportunity to restore those focused resources that you had been devoting towards working through your chatter. When you're worried or ruminating about something, you're really focusing hard on trying to solve that problem. You're not making much progress, but you're focusing really hard. When you go for a walk in nature, your attention drifts, but in a very soft way. You're not carefully scrutinizing the geometrical structure of the tree leaves around you, or at least I'm not. I don't think most people are. I'm just taking it in. And taking it in that manner can be really restorative. So that's one way that nature can help us. The other way it can is by providing us with opportunities to experience the emotion of awe. Awe is an emotion we experience when we're in the presence of something vast and indescribable, something that you just can't contemplate how this came to be. And nature is filled with those awe triggers. For example, an amazing sunset, or looking at at least where I am right now, the autumn leaves. Looking at the color of leaves can be quite beautiful, and they continue to change throughout the year. And when you experience awe, what ends up happening is we experience something called a shrinking of the self. When you are contemplating something vast and indescribable, you feel smaller in comparison. And when you feel smaller, so too does your chatter. So I'll go for a stroll around the neighborhood to try to restore my attention and experience some awe as another way of hoping to manage my chatter.
Powerful, powerful. Thank you so much. Those are incredibly helpful, and I'm sure a lot of people will have a huge shift, even just practicing one of them. So to have all of them feels like such a gift. So thank you, Ethan. And how did you come up with these concepts? Like, I know that you are the director of the Emotion Self-Control Lab. Did you discover this through your work? And then can you just kind of walk us through the process and how you were able to come up with some of these concepts?
Sure. So a lot of the work that we do in the lab and that we've been doing for close to 20 years now, when I started in this business in graduate school, is in trying to figure out when people are struggling with problems, how can we get them to work through those experiences effectively rather than succumb to chatter. But in terms of the tools that I talked to you about today and the tools that are written about in my book, those go well beyond what we've done in my lab alone. When I was researching the book, I was really trying to look at what have we learned over the past 20 or 30 years with respect to what science-based tools are out there to managing our inner voice. And so the book is really a grand tour of scientific insights surrounding this issue that go beyond what we do idiosyncratically here at the University of Michigan.
And what about the self-control piece? What have you learned about self-control?
Well, I like to, it's funny. A lot of people, when they hear the term self-control, they instantly think about how do you not succumb to temptation, like eating the treat after bedtime or consuming drugs, and that certainly is a form of self-control. But I like to use a broader definition of self-control. I think self-control captures everything we've been talking about during this conversation. When you're trying to manage your chatter is part of you. It's part of the self. So controlling that chatter is, to me, a form of self-control. Controlling your emotions is a form of controlling yourself because the emotions are part of who we are. So I define self-control very, very broadly as our ability to align our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors with our goals. And so if you have the goal of reining in an emotional response, if you have a goal of muffling your chatter, that to me is self-control.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. And how long does it take people to kind of learn that self-control? Like, is it something that you can teach people? How does that timeline work?
Absolutely. I think you can definitely teach people about how to control themselves, their emotions, feelings, and behaviors effectively. Some of the tools that are out there for doing this are really easy to implement. Others take more effort. And it's usually a combination of both the effortful and less effortful tools that help folks. But some of the things that I talk about in chatter are they're easy to implement and you see benefits right away. Others take longer. It really depends on the person and the situation. There is tremendous variability in terms of what combinations of tools work best for different people. I actually think that this is the key challenge that we face both as a science and as a society. Where I think we are right now is this. Science has revealed many different tools that exist to help us manage our emotional lives. I can tell you how those individual tools work mechanistically, why they work, and so forth. What I can't tell you is why one person should use these 3 tools to deal with this situation, but another person should use these 6 tools to deal with that situation they're dealing with. The science isn't yet at the point where we can make those kinds of prescriptions about combinations of tools and which combinations work best for different people. That's the kinds of questions that we are now trying to answer in the lab, and it is a very exciting domain of inquiry that we are embarking on in trying to do so. But while we try to answer those questions, which can often take some time, I think there's an opportunity for listeners to do some self-experimentation, to try out these different tools and figure out for themselves, hey, which are the ones that work best for me and which ones don't? If a tool isn't serving you well, don't use it. If it is, keep using it. And then maybe layer on another tool. That's the challenge I think we face right now. And it's one that I hope listeners avail themselves of after they hear this conversation or read the book.
how long does it often take for a tool to have a dramatic kind of shift? Or maybe the better question is, do you ever get pushed back into your kind of critic and kind of panic mode, even with this knowledge? Or are you in a space where you ingrained it so deeply in your response to conflict that it's just almost like second nature for you?
Do I experience chatter times? Absolutely. There's still, times where I get a little caught up with things. Knowing about the science has absolutely got me much better at managing chatter. I'm really good at detecting when it's about to begin. And the moment I detect it brewing, I immediately start using these tools. And in many cases, they nip that reaction in the bud before it escalates. There are some times where some of the tools that had been working don't work for a particular situation. And when that happens, I switch to another tool. But it is very, very rare that I get stuck for a prolonged period of time, overwhelmed by the chatter. So they do work. I do not think it is possible to rid one's life completely of chatter. I think that is very, very unlikely. I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal should be to shorten the amount of time you spend in that chatter. And if you can do that, I think the benefits that you derive will be quite powerful.
So, Ethan, you mentioned earlier that this doesn't usually kind of apply to, or maybe there hasn't been research on whether it applies to folks who have, I guess, severe, cognitive disorders. But what about people who have like mild depression? Because I think that seems to be like such a big ailment of our time, especially in this like pandemic world. It seems like a never ending pandemic. But how do you? How, do you have a prescription for people that are mildly depressed, or are some cognitive disorders just not applicable?
No, so some of these tools have certainly been studied in the context of not just mild depression, but clinical depression and clinical forms of anxiety and intense anger. And there have been, some of these tools have been shown to generalize and be useful for those populations. It's hard to draw any sweeping conclusions, because these 30-something tools, let's say, they have not been systematically looked at across different disorders and levels. What I was trying to do in the book was really pull together lots of different strands from many different labs. What have we learned? But I think there is a lot of evidence suggesting that many of these tools can be effective for people who are struggling with moderate forms of anxiety or depression, which is to say, many of us at certain points in our life, like when you say moderate depression or moderate anxiety, what I take that to mean is not a clinical manifestation, but rather succumbing to those emotional states for, like many of us do periodically. And my advice there is, try out some of the tools, and if they help you, keep using them. And if they don't use them.
Got it. Okay. And what about, some people, I think there's a lot of schools of thought that talk about how turning inwards to kind of understand our feelings is beneficial, while other people sort of fall apart when they engage in the kind of same inquiry and same behavior. Why is that? Why, for some people, is that so scary, and for others, not?
Well, that gets to the really crux of the book and of the research that we've been trying to do in this space. And one of the reasons why we often find introspection harmful and why it often backfires is because we zoom in so narrowly on the problem and really lose perspective. And that's one of the reasons why some of the distancing tools that I talk about can be helpful. They zoom us out. They allow us to focus on that bigger picture in ways that can be helpful. Now, it does make sense that you would reflexively zoom in on a problem when you're dealing with it, you want to focus on the issue at hand. But if we get stuck in that zoomed out state, that's when introspection can cease to be useful.
Got it. Got it. So if you get stuck in the zoomed in space, then yeah, got it. Okay. What about folks who might have like louder, critical voices or inner critics than others? Have you noticed that? Like, and is that also just kind of a reflection of their own personality or culture?
Um, I louder inner voices or inner critics. So if by that you mean they're more prone to chatter, we see chatter playing out across different cultures. So that's not really a big source of variability. Where cultures differ are in terms of what the source of the chatter is. So a person living in the United States may be prone to experiencing chatter over issues that a person living in Japan, for example, might not, and it might be different there. But in terms of the overall rate or frequency with which people experience chatter, I'm not aware of cross-cultural research that has documented that.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about why you've dedicated your time and your life to this world and this space. Can you talk to us about what attracted you to this work and about your own experience?
Sure. Growing up, my dad would talk to me a lot about the benefits of introspection and encouraged me every time I experience a problem to turn my attention inward, tap into my inner voice, and find a solution. And by and large, that strategy worked really well for me growing up. If I experienced some form of adversity, I do exactly what he said, come up with a solution and move on. I never really got stuck. And then I got to college, took my first psychology class, and discovered that a lot of people do exactly what my dad told me to do and benefit as a result. But sometimes people often don't benefit and they start experiencing rumination and anxiety, what I call chatter. And so that ended up becoming a really interesting puzzle for me. Why is it that at times we turn our attention inward and find solutions to our problems, but at other times doing the exact same thing leads us astray? And of course, that has happened to me at times too. And so I just became really, really interested in that question and in that puzzle. I thought about it as a type of puzzle of human nature, and it motivated me to go to graduate school to learn how to use the tools of science to try to answer that question. And that's what I've been busy doing ever since.
So, yeah, fascinating. Love that. And what about in terms of the last, like, let's say 10 years, since you've been, kind of in this space and more, have you noticed a shift in people's emotional world? Like, has there been any kind of trend that you've seen about any of the work that you're doing? And I think especially so since the pandemic started. I mean, how has that played out with some of your research?
Well, we're living through what I've called the chatter event of the last 100 years in the form of this pandemic, because what the pandemic has done is presented us with a situation that we're not certain about what's going to happen next. And it's also a situation in which we have not really had a whole lot of control over what happens. And experiencing uncertainty and a lack of control, those are the building blocks those constitute the jet fuel that propels chatter forward. And we see that manifesting in skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression. Last I checked, they were up 30% here in the States compared to before the pandemic. So I think on the one hand, over the past year and a half, there has been a really crucial need for people to have more insight into what's happening in their emotional lives. And there's been, I think, a real opportunity to give folks tools to help them manage it. What we've also experienced concurrently with COVID, and even starting a little bit before, is a movement to recognize the importance that our emotional lives play in our lives, and the idea that the ability to manage those emotions is an essential tool that is not something we can take for granted, but that is often the difference between being successful and not. So there's been a rise of interest in concepts like mental fitness, and a push to make it acceptable to talk about the kinds of issues we've been spending this conversation chatting about, talking about that in work, at school, and at home. Whereas not too long ago, talking about those private experiences was considered somewhat taboo and a sign of weakness. So I think we're pushing forward in a pretty positive way. It would be nice if we could get rid of the pandemic, but even if we can't, we definitely know that there are tools to help people manage their chatter around it effectively.
Right, right. And even just the example of zooming out of this time we're in and just knowing that at some place there will be, some sense of maybe balance, I hope, in this world and in all of our worlds. And Ethan, what about, and I'm not sure if you have studied this, but I'd love to know what you think is the future of humanity, and also like how technology has shifted our emotional world. And because there's so much data out there, and there's a ton of now documentaries that have proven that our technology and the social media and being on smartphones and having this constant comparison, thing happening has really just created a lot of damage. I mean, yes, there's been opportunity, but there's been also a lot of damage and fallout in the human psyche, I think collectively and especially in the West. What do you think has surprised you the most on this journey?
That's a great question. One of the most interesting discoveries I've had on this journey is actually has to do with how to get help from other people when it comes to chatter. There's been research that goes back quite a while, which has shown that venting doesn't help people get better when it comes to chatter. Yet so many people continue to do that and believe that venting is a solution. So that's been really, really interesting to see that an intuition that a lot of people have doesn't actually cash out, so to speak, when you look at some of the science. That's been one of the most interesting observations I've had.
And so we're wrapping up soon, but I also wanted to know what books or resources have inspired you on this path, and also if you could share the title of your book with the audience.
Sure. One of the books that's inspired me the most is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, story of a Holocaust survivor who loses everything before the war and is then put in a concentration camp, has his family slaughtered, but manages to persevere by changing the way he thinks about his circumstances. And I was reading that book in college. It was very powerful for highlighting the potential of the human mind to help us weather adversity if we could figure out how to harness its potential. And it's a book I reread almost every year. I assign it to all the students in the seminars I teach. So that really played a foundational role in my intellectual development in this space, and I'm grateful for it. The name of my book is Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It.
Excellent. And it's on Amazon, correct?
Yeah, you could find the book on Amazon and in most other places that books are sold.
That's great. And what's next for you and at the lab? What are you guys kind of working on next?
We're doing a lot of work to try to figure out how different combinations of tools work for different people to help them manage adversity in response to different kinds of events. And this question of how different kinds of tools work together, I think, is one of the really big ones we face. So we're trying really hard to solve that. And we're also doing research in which we teach high school kids about these strategies and are then going to look to see what implication does learning about the science concerning how to manage the human mind, does that actually give these high school kids an advantage over time in terms of their ability to achieve, to feel well, and to maintain good relationships. And so that's a big project we're getting ready to launch in a couple of months.
Amazing. And what do you want to tell our audience, our listeners about their mental health, their wellness, well-being? What's sort of your main takeaway, call to action, if you could tell folks
Well,
something?
my main call to action is twofold. If you find yourself experiencing chatter at times and are motivated to manage it, try using some of the different tools that I talk about in my book. If a tool works for you, keep using it. If not, use something else. But really try to find the combination of tools that work best for you. And number two, help others in your life do the same. I think there's a responsibility we all have to share this information with others. And so if you could share what you've learned, I think that would be doing a good thing for society.
Mm. Yes, amen. So are there any resources that you can point folks to in order to learn more about you and your work? Where can people follow you?
They can, if folks want to learn more about the book, my research, they could go to my website, www.ethankross with a Kross.com. And there's lots of information on that site about everything we've talked about today. And they could find me on social media as well, on Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn.
Amazing. And Ethan, so is there any question that I have not asked that you would have liked me to ask, just to share maybe something that I may have missed that's important for you to share with our audience?
I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
Okay. Okay, great. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Ethan. This has been so delightful. And I'm excited to try out these tools in my own life. I think a lot of people in the audience will as well. And we'll head over to Amazon, get your book, Chatter. So thank you so much, Ethan.
Thanks for having me, Yasmin. Good luck with everything. And thank you for doing what you do.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about the inner critic with Ethan Kross, and you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, personal development, and spirituality. Thanks again.